Right, so let's apply the principles we know on the timeline, for example, 8.2. The at acquisition retained earnings is the 27,500. We did discuss what happens at acquisition date, and what you picked up from the two at acquisition consolidation journal entries was that the full 27,500 retained earnings of S at acquisition date still eliminated. The fact that it was moved to the two separate equity participants didn't change the fact that you still eliminated the full retained earnings at acquisition date. So what we have to do is to identify the movement since acquisition date. And what you have to pick up here is that 27,500 is included in that TB balance. The fact that you split the 27,500 out to the different equity participants doesn't take away that that balance is included in the TB and that the full balance needs to eliminate, so that you are left with the movement of 120,000 Rand. Please note, you are not only deducting 7,500 at for the ordinary shares. We start with the total movement. Then we decide how much of that movement is attributable to the ordinary and the preference shareholders. So your movement in the analysis of equity on the timeline is always the actual movement in that retained earnings balance of S since to opening balance. So after you've correctly identified the movement, that 120,000 Rand now represents the retained earnings of S that is allowed to be in the group. The next question to ask is, who is that 120,000 Rand attributable to? And your answer lies in whether it's cumulative or non-cumulative preference shares, and whether the preference dividend was in arrears or not. Now in this example, it is cumulative preference shares, and the additional information indicated that the preference dividend for this period since to opening balance is in arrears. So for purposes of attributing the 120,000 Rand, you first have to exclude the portion of that 120,000 Rand that is attributable to the preference shareholders, that they are entitled to. And because it's cumulative preference shareholders, they are entitled to a fixed annual dividend of 10,000 Rand per year, regardless of whether that dividend was declared or not. Now this period since to opening balance, since acquisition to opening balance, only represents one period. So the preference dividend that's in arrears is also only for one period. That then leaves you with 110,000 Rand, which is attributable to the parent and NCI in their 70%, 30% holding as ordinary shareholders. We always write a journal entry for the portion attributable to NCI, and that would be 33,000, for which you need a journal entry. But because the preference dividend was not declared in X9, the preference portion attributable to NCI will change their balance, because the dividend wasn't declared to contra that amount attributed out. So what you have done up to now was to only attribute 110,000 Rand of the movement, but you have to attribute the full movement. So what you have to do on top of this is to also attribute this 10,000 Rand. And that's the second step that you have to remember that is applicable when you're working with a cumulative preference shareholder and there's a preference dividend in arrears. This 10,000 is then attributed to parent NCI in their 40%, 60% percentage holding as preference shares. And now you do have a journal for that 6,000 Rand attributable to NCI being a part of the opening balance of S. Before we do this, the current year movement, I want to take you to the solution in your textbook and show you now the actual consolidation journal entries that you have to write for since acquisition date, where we measure NCI, so that you can bring together what we did on the timeline to the actual consolidation journal entry you have to write. So I am looking at the since acquisition consolidation journal entries of example 8.2. This is where we measure NCI. And here you can now see the journal entry for the 33,000 Rand that we've identified on that timeline. We debit the retained earnings of S and we credit NCI. So we're ultimately moving out of the retained earnings of S an amount attributable to my NCI ordinary shares, and I'm left with the portion attributable to the owners of the parent. But in the since to opening balance period, we didn't only identify the 33,000 Rand for which we need a journal. We said we need a journal for the 6,000 Rand as well, because the NCI preference shares balance will change with that 6,000 Rand because the dividend was not declared to them. So they were only increased with the portion attributable to NCI, and this is then the journal entry you need for that. It's for the 6,000 Rand, and it's exactly the same journal entry. Debit the retained earnings opening balance of S, credit non-controlling interests, again moving out of retained earnings an amount to NCI. So at this point, your NCI balance will comprise of the two at acquisition measurement amounts, plus the 33,000 for the ordinary shares, plus the 6,000 Rand for the preference shares. This is something that's different when you compare this to example 8.1. It's important that you can see that there's an additional consolidation journal entry in example 8.2 that didn't exist in example 8.1. We did discuss the reason behind it. Please make sure that you know exactly why we have this extra journal entry in 8.2 that we didn't have in example 8.1. So let's now look at the current year movements in the retained earnings of the subsidiary. The first item is the profit from the trial balance of the subsidiary as part of the movement in retained earnings of 130,000 Rand. Now, when you start and you are busy with Chapter 8 and you know that we do have preference shareholders as well, the question you ask is, who is that 130,000 Rand attributable to? Now, before we answer that question, just remember what 8.2 was all about. At acquisition date, the X7 and X8 preference dividends were in arrears, the X9 preference dividend was in arrears, and in X10, the preference dividend declared was the 30,000 Rand, which relates to the X9, X7, and X8 that ended up being declared and paid in 20X10. But the X10 preference dividend was again not declared, and there was also no ordinary dividend. Now, before you can decide how much of that 130,000 Rand is attributable to the ordinary and the preference shareholders, you need to know that it is cumulative preference shares. And if it's cumulative preference shares, the portion attributable to them annually is their annual fixed preference dividend, not the actual dividend declared. So, keeping that in mind, of that 130,000 Rand, how much is attributable to the preference shares? Will you take out the full 30,000 Rand and say what's left is attributable to the ordinary shareholders? Or what do you think? What have we done? At acquisition date, we have attributed 20,000 Rand to the preference shareholders. We've moved it to the preference share analysis and the at acquisition consolidation journal entry. We have attributed 10,000 to them since to opening balance. So we have already attributed to them that 30,000 Rand that got declared to them in X10. Remember the two steps, attribute versus declared. So will it be correct to deduct the full 30,000 again and attribute that again on top of having done that already? And your answer is no. This will not be the right way to do it. What will be the portion included in that 130,000 Rand that is attributable to the preference shareholders? And this is again one annual fixed dividend for one reporting period. And now I am busy with only one reporting period, so that is only 10,000 Rand. What I'm now left with is the profit of S that is attributable to the ordinary shareholders. That will be attributed to parent NCI in their 70%, 30% shareholding. And what is the amount that we need a journal entry for? There will be 36,000, for which we need a journal entry, profit attributable to NCI. But I'm not done yet, because at this point I've only attributed the 120,000 Rand. I also have to attribute the 10,000 Rand that I've moved from the total profit as the portion of the profit attributable to parent NCI, and this will be in their 40%, 60% percentage holding, and that gives you an amount of 6,000 Rand, and you need a further journal entry. So in the current year, we followed the same approach. We decided how much is attributable to the preference and ordinary shareholders, and we attributed accordingly. Just a final reminder, this 10,000 Rand that I'm excluding there is because it's a cumulative dividend, not because any dividends were declared or not. And because you have attributed an annual amount to them since acquisition date and at acquisition date as well, you only attribute a further annual dividend in 20X10. The actual dividend that was declared in X10 is the 30,000 Rand. And that is the actual dividend declared by S, which will lead to an intra-group consolidation journal entry where we have to eliminate the effect thereof.